Hello, I have another request video from someone whose handle is at creativehaley. Thank you so much for your request. It was an interesting project to look into, and she had been reading a novel that was set in around 1712 and would like more information on the fashions that were going on then for men and women, so she could put a picture to her imagination. It's an interesting period because it's almost the transitional period between the end of the Baroque era, which is in the 1600s, to the start of the Georgian era in the 1700s. This is what the fashions look like in the earlier Baroque period. Here we have the fashions of the later Rococo period. Now, Queen Anne was on the throne of Britain between 1702 and 1714. So in the middle of that, we get our era of 1712, which is Queen Anne's style. The underskirts had started to become bigger and wider with hooped panniers. Dramatic lacy cuffs of the later Baroque period and decorative underskirts were very popular. The new panniers were now shorter than the later Georgian ones, and they were graduated with three-tier hoops of whalebone. Introduced in 1709, the Tatler Journal magazine between 1709 and 11 was stating, "It is now rather bell-shaped." It's the era of what was called the Mantua, which was rather like an over-dressing gown that was slipped on over the top of your understays, and a gorgeous decorated stomacher, which is that middle bit there, and this is the overgown pinned on over the top, the Mantua. So we have a Mantua fashion, which is what the fashions would have actually looked like in around 1712. Here is a very suave man that would have been around in 1712 also. Now, the Mantua gown was gathered up at the back into the very first bustle back. The word Mantua comes from the old French word of mantle or manteau, actually translating as overgown. Originally coming from the Italian court and had been influenced from the city of Mantua, which was known then for its silk production. So let's start with the layers of the men's clothing that would have been around at that time. First and foremost, there would always have been a shirt or a shift of linen that was next to the skin, and it would have had ruffles at the front of the neck here. White silk or woolen stockings. They weren't really wearing pants or pantaloons, not the men at this time, but then the breeches would go on over the top that were knee length. At the top of that was the waistcoat or the vest, which would be richly decorated and embroidered ornately. The overcoat, which was called a Justacorps, and that's from an old French word or phrase, juste au corps, which translates as close to the body. And the coat was generally worn open, so you could show off this beautifully decorated undervest or waistcoat. It was usually flared at the bottom and stiffened by something called a pasteboard, which I'll explain to you later, and so that it had this flowing shape, and topped off with a very nice long brown curled wig, which was more natural looking than the later ones of the powdered periwigs in the Georgian era. High-heeled shoes for men with red heels were very fashionable. And for relaxing and housewear, this very, very nice overgown called a banyan robe comes from the Gujarat word in India of vanyo. Somehow it's developed into that, which meant merchant. And so that's what they were wearing when they were trading with us. Women's clothes always started with a shirt shift or chemise, which was either of linen or silk, but mainly linen. It was more comfortable. Very nice white silk stockings tied off at the top with an embroidered garter. Some women were now wearing these pantaloons. Then there would have been an underskirt and the panniers over the top. And next on would go your stays. Over the top of that, another underskirt, and in the winter sometimes it would be a quilted one for warmth. After that you would get your over underskirt on. Then of course would come the stomacher, which was pinned on. The Mantua gown then was put on over the top, the all-in-one Mantua gown, and bustled up at the back or made into a train. Like this here. See these stiff boards here? Bustle back with these stiff decorative boards here. Well, those were achieved with something called paste board, and that was a bit like our papier-mâché today. Bits of old and cheap pieces of paper which were stuck together and formed into the shape underneath that to make it all stiff. The undersleeves, called engageants, were pinned on separately, and there could also be a paste board support to go underneath your bustle for extra support. Now, it was only usually the chemise that was ever washed. The outer clothes were usually made in silk or pure wools and cottons, and they were too delicate to scrub clean, so you would just wash your under chemise. And it was during a heat wave, apparently in July 1707, that this lady, Duchess Elizabeth Charlotte, the Duchess of d'Orléans, who was the sister-in-law to Louis XIV, she had written that she had had to change her chemise in this heat wave at least 8 times. That was only a privilege of the rich and wealthy that could own 8 chemises. It was as if it had been dipped into water. Ladies' shoes were high-heeled, but they were usually pointed, and they had a buckle fastening on the front. The working classes would have worn the same sort of thing, but dumbed down, not so decorative and in cheaper materials. But they were still now wearing the same sort of styles as their influencers. Now see the hairstyle with these little decorative curls on the front? That was known as the cow's horn curl hairstyle. And the fontange headdress was not as tall as previous eras, smaller and more rounded and daintier. Thank you, Creative Haley, for your very interesting and lovely request video. I hope you've all enjoyed another historical fashion story. If you have, do join me again next time. Until then, bye.